Hi everyone. You must already know about the big controversy that has erupted around Ashis Nandy at the Jaipur Literary Festival yesterday. Before I share with you what I think about everything that unfolded yesterday, I'd like to take you through what really happened because I was at the session and heard the entire conversation. The session was called Republic of Ideas and several speakers were speaking about different aspects of India. And at one point, Tarun Tejpal, the editor of Tehelka, spoke about the issue of corruption and put forward this idea that the phenomenon of corruption could also be read and interpreted in a different way, which is to say that most of the structures in our society have been created by the elite and by the powerful classes to preserve the status quo and to preserve the hierarchy of power that exists in society. So very often the poor are pushed to subvert the system to be able to break through the glass ceilings that keep them in their place. This is not to say that Tarun or anybody is saying that corruption is not to be combated or that Tehelka's work doesn't itself try to expose and combat corruption, but it was to give a larger sociological view on it. Tarun mentioned Dhirubhai Ambani and of how perhaps if he had not used corrupt means that he may have stayed the petrol pump attendant he began life as, rather than have broken through into the club of the rich in India. Ashis Nandy picked up this thread of argument and reaffirmed that position by saying that he too believed that corruption was a kind of social vehicle, a mode of social churn in our country, because it is only through corruption very often that the poor are able to access the entitlements that by rights should be theirs. He also said that the corruptions of the rich are not noticed because they have greater finesse and are able to do it in ways that pass as commonplace giving of favors or even nurturing of talent when there's nepotism. And in that context, he said that very often the corruptions of the poor or those who have newly broken through the glass ceilings is much more conspicuous because a certain kind of desperation drives them. They believe only in the loyalty of family members rather than other structures. They haven't even been able to create other structures around them that will protect their interests. And so very often it looks dynastic, it looks familial, and it looks conspicuous. Having made that point, he said, and I would concede that it was a clumsily worded statement. In fact, he himself said that what I'm going to say now sounds vulgar, but perhaps it is the SC, STs and OBCs that are the most corrupt now. But even if that is the case, Ashis said that he believes that is what will keep, as long as the proportion of the poor are more corrupt than the proportion of the rich, it will keep the Republic of India safe because it is proof and sign that social churn is in process. At this juncture, Ashutosh of CNN of IBN7, who was also one of the speakers, jumped in very agitatedly and said that this was one of the most outrageous statements that he had ever heard in public life. And unfortunately, Urvashi Butalia, who was the moderator of the session, instead of asking Ashis to further elaborate or perhaps modify his statement or explain what he really meant, passed it on to the audience. There was a kind of question-answer and the session ended there. Unfortunately, what then got played out in the media was a clip of Ashis Nandy's speech completely taken out of context of the larger point that he was making, which was completely pro-poor, pro-Dalit, pro-the backward classes, and only played out this clumsily worded sentence again and again to a point where different political parties jumped in. And today, this 74-year-old scholar now stands at risk of having the atrocities against the SC/ST Act invoked against him. All of this is a terrible irony because Ashis Nandy is a scholar, a sociologist and a psychologist who has written for over 30-40 years in defense of the poor. He has been committed to subalterns and has been committed to reservations even when it is unpopular. Today, to pull a statement of his out of context is to do him a great disservice. It is to do the whole idea of free speech in this country a great disservice. And I have to concede that it is something that we in the media do way too often to too many people. Apart from what this means for Dalits and for OBCs, I think it really brings up a crucial issue of freedom of speech. Let us concede for the moment that Ashis phrased something badly and should be called to, even confronted by it. But why should this not stay merely in the realm of healthy debate, of healthy verbal and intellectual confrontation? By what radar or what standard are we to judge that this is an atrocity against the SC and STs, and that political leader after political leader, rather than enshrining the values of the Constitution, have asked the police to review these statements rather than applying their own minds and applying their own brains on it? Just a session earlier in the day or the day before, I personally spoke on the freedom of speech and of how dangerously we are beginning to narrow that space in India. I personally feel the Article 19.2 should be up for great debate. We need to narrow down those definitions. We need to severely narrow down the conditions under which freedom of speech can be restricted, and against which legal liabilities can be set into motion. And that is not to say that there should not be healthy or angry debate around things that are said in public life. Just one final point I'd like to make is that forums like the Jaipur Literary Festival are important because they catalyze ideas. It's not a journalistic exercise, it's not an academic exercise, it's not a political exercise. It's meant to be a space for the free exchange of ideas. And if we're going to increasingly narrow that space, even the freedom or the sense that you can say things, untested ideas, even provocative ideas, in a milieu where people are listening and are ready to discuss them and contest them, but you're too afraid to do that because you may be misquoted by, I must admit, sometimes an extremely blinkered media, then we are really endangering our society. Because the fact is that societies are not static. The only way that the boundaries can shift, rearrange themselves, modify themselves, is if a society is in constant dialogue with itself. And so I would really urge that we stand up for our right to speak freely, to often cause discomfort. I have strong disagreements with many schools of thought in this country, be it the extreme Hindu right or the Islamist right or the Christian right or many economic points of view. And while I reserve the right to disagree and debate these things with great heat and passion, at the same time, I would stand by the rights of my opponents to every other right that is enshrined in the Constitution, which is the equal access to opportunity, to justice, to travel freely, to worship who you will, and to hold beliefs that are contrary to mine. And so I would put to you that the freedom of speech must be restricted only on very precise and very few grounds. What is the whole idea of freedom of speech without the idea of discomfort? If we are only going to speak in ways that make each other feel comfortable, then we might as well give up on the idea of free speech in India altogether.